Business news now, and consumer prices continue to rise in Nigeria, causing misery for many. Inflation rose by an annual rate of almost 21% in September. That's a fresh 17-year high. While food prices accounted for about a third of the increase, analysts voiced concern at the broad-based nature of inflation and warned that the central bank is likely to raise interest rates yet again at its November meeting. Well, Rice correspondent Laurie Laird is still with us. She's standing by in London with the business headlines of the day. Good to see you again. Laurie, what's behind the latest rise in Nigerian inflation?
Well, unlike when we've had this conversation over the past couple of months, it's not just food price inflation. When inflation started to run away about 6 months ago in Nigeria, it was mostly increased costs of food, particularly with the situation in Ukraine, preventing so many grains, cooking oils getting out of that region of the world. Food price inflation is starting to settle a little bit, but the concern is that this inflation has become more broad-based. Shelter costs were up a great deal in the last month. And that is concerning to economists because it means that in many places we are starting to see, we're almost at a point where we can see inflation peaking, perhaps not so much in Nigeria, and that's a concern.
And what sense do you get of where things are? Are we anywhere closer to a peak in price pressures?
I think that the Central Bank of Nigeria would like to see a peak, particularly with an election coming up in February. It's not comfortable necessarily to be raising interest rates leading up into an election. But there are a lot of things about the Nigerian economy that make one think that perhaps inflation could peak a little bit later. One is these floods that we are seeing that are putting agricultural land underwater. That will hurt food yields, and that will keep food price inflation high. The other is the depreciation of the naira, which makes imports much more expensive. And there are also concerns that after the election, that whoever the winner is may cut some of those fuel subsidies, which will make fuel higher, and that again will contribute to inflation. So there are a number of reasons to fear that the peak of inflation in Nigeria may come later than in other economies.
Well, let's turn to France, Laurie, where the government has ordered crucial oil workers back to their jobs. I mean, what's the latest there? What's happening?
Absolutely. And it's a very brave French government that defies workers in France. And this government has backed off in the past. But what has happened is the government has ordered crucial workers to go back to work in a number of refineries, not a large number of workers, but enough to be able to refill lorries with crude oil or with petroleum oil that can then be distributed throughout the country. However, protests about the cost of living in general have spread from the outside of these refineries into France's biggest cities, places like Paris, other cities in France. So it doesn't look like these protests are going away anytime soon. The extraordinary thing is that Total, which is the biggest oil company in France, has reached an agreement with the majority of its employees, but it is one hardline union, the CGT, which is holding out for higher wage hikes. The irony is that inflation in France is a lot lower than in most of its competitors, below 6% and falling in France, where we're looking at about almost 10% in the EU, almost 10% in the UK. So France is willing to entertain price rises that top inflation, but this one holdout union is looking for more.
Well, I mean, if that union is holding out for more, the protests are not necessarily going away, in spite of the fact that the government's ordered workers back to the job. Does that get Emmanuel Macron out of trouble, or is he still mired in it?
I think he is mired in it, and some of his promised economic reforms, and one of the things he has really staked his reputation on is raising the retirement age in France. He tried to get that through in his first term in office, and the Yellow Jacket protests, which were also about fuel prices, stymied that effort. And he has promised to do this again, or did so in his second presidential campaign. He no longer has a majority in parliament. So So I think any kind of heavy-duty structural reform from Macron is probably out the window, which is unfortunate. We haven't even been through his first year of the second term.
Well, I mean, let's turn to the other character. I understand he's changed his name, actually, but he's never far from the headlines. What's Kanye West up to now? I mean, I wouldn't even know how to pronounce his new name.
I know, and I'm afraid that I get into trouble when I start with this one. And yes, yet again, we are talking about Kanye West, or Ye, as he would like to be called. He has taken a couple of steps into the business world. Collaborations with chain stores or brands. Adidas, the Gap, his Gap collection, his designer collection, was very, very well received. He has terminated arrangements with both of those companies. New step into business, and he says that he is going to buy the social media company Parler. Now, Parler is not a hugely well-known social media company. They say they only have about 15 million subscribers, but it punches above its weight in terms of its influence in the right wing. Parler was used extensively, we understand, when the January 6th insurrection. Kanye West has decided he no longer wants to be canceled, as he was last week after his rather controversial anti-Semitic comments. So instead of dealing with being canceled on social media, it looks like he's just going to buy the company.
Well, I mean, I'm curious because sometimes, some of these controversial things end up being great marketing tools. I mean, how is he doing with his sales and the people who follow him? Are those numbers going up? Are they tailing off? What's the story there?
Kanye West has a brand, and as a marketer, I think he still has a great deal of pull. When he terminated his arrangement with Gap about 6 weeks ago, it wasn't because necessarily of an agreement with Gap, or it wasn't because Gap said, wait a second, Kanye West has become, slightly controversial. We want to terminate this arrangement. The termination was all on Kanye West's side. He said that he had been promised some exclusive stores from Gap, some exclusive promotion of his designer items. His contribution to Gap probably needed him more than he needed Gap. Gap is a bit of a flagging U.S. retailing brand, but every item that Kanye West brought out under the auspices of his Gap collection sold out in a couple of occasions. And I'm thinking of a light blue puffer jacket, sold out before it even got to the stores. So his contribution as a designer for Gap was incredibly crucial to Gap's bottom line.
Very interesting indeed. Laurie, thanks ever so much. Laurie led Arise business correspondent, talking to me there from London.